Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, and we're ready to help you kick off the second half of the F1 fantasy season. Rob, are you ready for more action?
Sure am, Adam. After our mid-season recap, we're certainly back into the swing of things. Lots of content to get through, and certainly a lot of headlines uh, making it onto our radar since our last race in Belgium.
I'm definitely ready for more action on track. I think as a fan, I really miss the sport, but as a content creator, I definitely enjoyed that little breather to reset, and now I'm back and ready for more. We have a fully loaded show again this week as we break down a dramatic Belgian Grand Prix and set the table for Zandvoort this week. We're going to end this episode walking through some of our top lineup options and take a look at some of the best teams in our featured league. So, Rob, let's kick things off on this episode with our winners and losers from Spa, and let's start with your first winner.
Yeah, for sure. I had Oscar Piastri as my first winner. You can see here, as an Aussie, I've got two Australians, and we'll get to Oscar first, but he had another very good result in Spa. Obviously, we'll get into George Russell shortly, but capitalized on his misfortune with that disqualification to bag 30 points and his third 30 plus point performance in his last four races. So I think Oscar's really flying. He's only one of three other relevant B tier assets, I would say, in the driver category right now. And just going from strength to strength, had a bit of a middling start to the season, but I've been very confident for some time now that since Miami, since Imola, Oscar has something to certainly build on with how good that car's looking. So another great result for him. I think his first win in Budapest will not be the last win for him in 2024 either. Give me your first winner.
My first winner, you can see the shirt is back out. 8-time Constructor Champ shirt comes out every time a Mercedes win, and this time it's for Sir Lewis Hamilton. So it's his second win in 3 races, and we'll get into the unusual circumstances of how he came to win in just a second, but he had 46 fantasy points to lead all drivers, including the third straight driver of the day that was not given to Lando Norris. So that was a refreshing change for us. He also continued his reign as the highest grossing driver for price changes in the month of July, with the only $1 million price increase on the grid. So teams that can afford a McLaren driver with Hamilton are absolutely feasting right now.
Yeah, Lewis has really, again, much like Oscar, delivered lately, and I think he's approaching that 25 million in the B tier asset class. So if you don't already own him, you've probably only got a handful of races left until he becomes a much less appealing option for us.
That's absolutely driving some of my lineup approaches for the next few weeks. We have a few drivers in our winners section that are approaching the next price tier, and so you're running out of time to get those price gains. So I'm totally with you on that. Rob, let's go through the second Aussie in your winner circle.
Yeah, I had Ricardo, and I think he more to his price gain than his points. I think recently you look at his score in Spa, 8 points, better than his teammate as well. He's had the wood over Yuki Tsunoda fantasy-wise. I'd say even though, yes, it's been pretty evenly matched, I would say, the last few races. But I think what Ricardo's value really shows is the fact that he's just hitting those points thresholds he needs every week to hit a price rise. He's had 5 $0.5 million increases in his last 6 races, which I think is exceptional value. I do suspect, though, that at 11.3 may be out of reach for some fantasy strategists. But in terms of production and price gain value, he's really delivering. And it's been, even though maybe not seeing the results on track, nice to see Daniel get some backing in the F1 fantasy world.
It's crazy to think that of the drivers that have gained the most value over the past 5 races, it's our first 2 winners in Hamilton and Piastri, and then Ricardo's number 3 on the grid. So he's having a fantastic stretch here. And these RB drivers, 3 straight races of top 10 finishes for one or the other. So definitely a great time to invest in either Yuki or Daniel. My second winner was Max Verstappen, and he led the most popular alternative lineup to the 2-tier B team and finished P4 in the grid, but P2 in fantasy scoring with 35 points. And we were expecting a bigger race from Max. This was a race where each of the last 2 seasons he's taken an engine penalty and set the highest fantasy score of the year in that race, which he didn't quite do this week, but his 6 overtakes were the most for him since Vegas last season. And so we're going to feature Max a little bit in our hit list coming up, just to talk about what this means moving forward and which template will make the most sense for us heading into Zandvoort.
I think Max is an interesting one because the last few races, he's certainly probably faded a little bit from our thought process because the double premium lineups have become very popular. 35 points, another weekend lately where he's been the second or third best scoring fantasy driver, but just because of his premium price tag has become a little less attractive to us. Now, I think on the topic of Max, that segues quite nicely into Final Fix. I want to start with that before I get onto George Russell as my first loser. And the reason why I have Final Fix users in Spas as more or less as a loser of sorts is because a lot of people try to capitalize on Max's overtakes in Spa, and he had 6 overtakes, 7 positions gained as you talked about, and a P4 to boot. But I think the Final Fix users were probably expecting a little bit more from Max and a little bit more budget gain from either Lando or Oscar, who were the popular McLaren drivers in qualifying that they used the Final Fix on. So I think a very creative approach to using the chip in Spa, capitalizing on that grid penalty, but probably not quite the outcome most who used it were hoping for.
No, absolutely. And for those that Final Fix Piastri into Verstappen, they scored 60 points, but rolling with just Max as your 2X driver scored 70 points. Meanwhile, like you mentioned with the price rob, Piastri only gained 0.1 million more than Max. So probably not the use of the chip that some folks were hoping for. And hopefully that will open up a little bit of an opportunity for the rest of us to sneak in some points here in the second half. You've mentioned the opportunity last year with Sainz at Qatar where he didn't start the race and you had to use it on an emergency basis. Maybe your 2X driver tanks in Q1 and you need to substitute them last minute. So still some great opportunities in these last 10 races to try to get more value out of the Final Fix.
Absolutely, absolutely. Looking forward to seeing how we can use that later in the season. Talk me through your first loser, Adam.
I didn't think we'd get to this guy in the losers column anytime soon, but for me, Lando was a loser this week. Just 17 fantasy points for him in this race, and when we look at races he's completed, this is his lowest score since all the way back in Jeddah, before McLaren's early season upgrade. So a tough race for Lando. And with him in Tier A, without driver of the day to buffer his score, it's starting to look a lot more tempting to run those Tier B assets. And Rob, you had mentioned it a moment ago with Verstappen. With these middling results, it doesn't quite justify that Tier A price tag, and now more and more strategists are flocking to those Tier B assets. So for me, that puts Lando in the losers column.
Yeah, it has been a funny one because, a lot of his appeal was driver of the day, and it seems to have gone out the window these last 3 races with Lewis picking up a double and Oscar Piastri bagging one as well. And I do think that Lando still has, some say and some weight in that driver of the day conversation, but I feel like his grip is weakening on that a little bit. And I think doubled with the fact, as we've mentioned, that where some people, myself included, are moving towards those other B tier assets, Lando seems to be the odd man out at the moment.
I imagine 2 months ago, hearing ourselves say that, we'd think we're nuts, but this is how crazy the 2024 season has been. There's just been so much parity, and that's made for great action on track.
Certainly.
Rob, let's go to your second loser.
Yeah. My second loser was George Russell. I think goes without saying that a disqualification and minus 25 on Sunday put paid to any of the good progress he'd made on that one-stop strategy. It was looking like a pretty underwhelming weekend for George after qualifying, only securing 4 fantasy points and a P8 finish there. So I wasn't overly optimistic as an owner heading into Sunday, but to see him come through the field on a one-stop strategy, put himself in the mix with 10 to 15 laps to go, Lewis obviously bearing down, and then to hold on for that win was so sweet. But then to have the rug dragged out from underneath and that disqualification when it came through a couple hours later after him being underweight was pretty brutal. I would say just as tough to swallow as our Limitless last year. So I do think that it was an exceptional drive, but for what would have been a $1 million increase, 40 odd points or so to kind of go the other way and end up with minus 21 was extremely tough to bear.
I think the struggle was the fact that the game showed us those provisional points up front. He had 35 provisional points once he crossed the line and then had a final score of negative 21. So it's a 56-point swing for George. Mercedes lost another 48 points. So if you stacked Russell with Mercedes, it was a 104-point swing between your provisional and final scores. And so that sent the global rankings really in a tailspin. I went from 9,800 in the global to 6,600. So it gives you a perspective of how many of those top 10,000 teams are running one or the other Mercedes asset. So a very, very disruptive result, and painful that that's going to be your last memory of the game before going into the summer breaks. Gives you a lot to stew on.
Yeah, it was tough, and conversely, the pendulum swung the other way from I think it was about 5,000 overall rank to just inside the top 10,000 now. So a bit of work to do to climb back into the top 5K or so. Give me your second loser, Adam.
My second loser is poor Zhou Guanyu, and his disappointing season continued with another DNF. This is his second on the year, negative 18 points on the weekend. And this is a guy who was one of our top overtake leaders last year, but he's 17th in the overtake category this year. So a really disappointing season for Zhou, very little in the way of price gains. And now as silly season starts to cool off, the grid for next year is starting to take shape. It's looking like he's going to be the odd man out without a drive.
Yeah, he's been a driver that we've definitely, after a pretty hot start, fantasy-wise to the year, since his 20-point haul in Miami, it's been nothing but bad news. His coming out below zero since Imola, and just not a pretty sight at all. I think Zhou is, just a more expensive Logan Sargent at this point. The Sauber offers no competitive pace on the Sunday, and he's historically a very bad qualifier as well. So you're kind of already fighting an uphill battle, and then throw in, that DNF in Spa, you're probably kicking yourself as an owner.
It's a great point. A lot of Zhou and Bottas's struggles explain why Sargent's selection percentage is so high. They're basically one and the same, and Sargent's much cheaper. So you'll find Sargent in a lot of our lineups when we get into the three lineups for three budgets piece later in the show. Let's move on now to our fifth gear GARMS giveaway question. Remember, you can head on over to the FanAmp app, move over to the Fantasy Formula base, and answer this question. Are you running Max Verstappen at his home race this weekend at Zandvoort? Why or why not? Now, Rob, we're starting this week in different positions. I ran Max at Spa, so he's starting this week in my lineup, whereas you didn't. What's your take on this?
I think it's probably a much more straightforward answer if you don't own the guy already. And quite frankly, I, at a low overtake track, have very little interest in upending my team to bring him in for 1 week. So it's a definite no. But his record at Zandvoort speaks for itself. Since returning to the calendar in 2021, Max has won the last 3 races in a row. So if you want a sure thing at the top of the field, even in a car that probably isn't the best anymore, I'm still taking the line on Max most times if I own him. What about you, Adam? You're in a slightly different situation.
So I'm starting the week with Max, but I think I'm going to pivot into a 2-tier B lineup, and that's going to be the big part of our hit list coming up in just a moment. For me, I've used every piece of evidence to be excited about Max, and it hasn't quite come through. He has strong records at these last few tracks. He hasn't won. He's had a brand new engine. He hasn't won. It's been warmer tracks that typically facilitate Red Bull speed, and he hasn't won in those conditions either. So I'm running out of reasons to be optimistic that he's going to truly dominate and really represent that tier A price tag. So for me, I'm going to move out of Max, even if it comes with a 10-point penalty, and invest more in those tier B assets.
Well, you heard it, guys. Adam's got him and he's moving off him. So if you're running with Max, and if you're not, give us a reason why in the FanAmp Waste. And as you said, that will enter you into our giveaway for the week.
And he's run on 41% of teams, so I think a lot of folks are going to have this conundrum going into the week. So I'm really excited to see what you all say in our FanAmp base. Now, moving on to the hit list, Rob, let's start with the rise of Oscar Piastri. So much of the first half of the season was about his teammate, Lando Norris. Piastri, over the last 4 races, has really made a huge comeback and contended for race wins consistently. Is it time for a change, to which McLaren is a must-have?
I think it's certainly moving in that direction. And I know Lando is still on my radar most race weeks just because of, he's a proven race winner. He's only had one, I will say that. But he is a driver that has consistently demonstrated good fantasy performances. Yes, I know it's well documented. He's got gremlins on that first turn in most races when he's on the front row. But I do think in that car, how good he is as a driver, it's hard for me to completely ignore him. Oscar, though, I think he's just come out of nowhere in the last half dozen or so races. He's getting close to that $25 million threshold that we've talked about and has bagged that driver of the day in Hungary. I think all the momentum is with him and a slightly lower ownership base, 20%, Adam. I have to say, if you haven't got Oscar, I'd say there's probably quite a few of you that are thinking about him very seriously heading into Zandvoort.
There's a lot of reasons to like Oscar, and a lot of people might be looking back at Lando's stretch where he scored 40 points in Canada and 51 in Spain, and are hoping he can get some of that mojo back. But since then, Piastri's outscored Lando in 3 of the last 4 races, and he appears to be the hotter of the 2 drivers. And like we mentioned earlier, with driver of the day now in play for anybody, it's not a lock for Lando, and it's something that may be less obvious that Piastri versus Lando, which one you should pick week to week. So my money's on Piastri moving forward, just because he's so close to being a tier A asset. Let's get those last good budget gains while we still can.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think he's probably got I'd say at least 3 races until he goes up. So still plenty of time to capitalize if you haven't got him in your team. The one thing I will say is, and we'll get onto this later in the show, is another track that doesn't have a very good or very high history of overtakes. And so I think you want those better qualifiers. The thing that I think favors Lando, if it's like for like, is that he hasn't Oscar outqualified Lando since Monaco, where Oscar was P2 and Lando P4. So if you're looking for a good qualifier, you're probably looking at Lando or Lewis Hamilton, maybe even George Russell. I'd say of those 4, Oscar's probably on my list, 3rd or 4th. So just keep that in mind heading into the deadline. But I think fantasy-wise, the stats on the screen here speak for themselves.
Well said. And as we're talking about some of those tasty price gains from the Tier B assets, let's talk about George Russell, because Rob mentioned a moment ago some of that heartbreak from Spa, but I think he's just a victim of some bad luck that he's going to break out of. He had that water system issue that took him out at the British Grand Prix. He had the flying lap in Q1 on a drying track in Hungary that the back markers all overtook him on. And then, of course, there was the disqualification at Spa. But if you look at it from a positive point of view, he took pole in that race in Silverstone. He gained 9 positions in Hungary despite starting at the back of the grid, and he was the first across the line at Spa. So the W15 is a contender, and I think if he can get his luck and his speed happening for him at the same race, George will be back at the front in no time.
100% agree with that. It's very much luck rather than poor performances from the driver himself lately, and you hit the nail on the head. Did everything he could in Silverstone, did everything and more in in Spa, I should say. And then you exclude those, he's had 3 27-point performances going all the way back to Canada, a 43, and the race win in Austria. I'm sure the tide will turn shortly for George Russell. I'm confident that he'll, in this Mercedes as well, which I think is right up there with the Red Bull. It's bound to, some good will come, I'm sure, for George Russell at 20.5 million, if I'm not mistaken, as well. 20.7 million. I think that's value for money. I'd say even a little underpriced based on what we're seeing from the Mercedes right now.
And so George is definitely a candidate to be on my team this week for all these reasons you said, Rob. And if you want a little more hopium, Mercedes fans, he vacated a win due to a disqualification, and only 5 other drivers have done that in the history of the sport. Hunt, Piquet, Prost, Senna, and Schumacher, all world champions. Is George next? We can only hope.
I think you're reaching a little bit, but I do think another win is certainly not outside of his reach this season. So keep an eye on the second stanza of 2024. I do think there's going to be a big second half for him and Oscar Piastri, who we just spoke about.
So we've been building the case for McLaren and Mercedes drivers to our first 2 points to talk about Zandvoort's history of overtakes. And so last year, you might have seen the F1 record 240 F1 fantasy overtakes that happened at this circuit and thought, wow, maybe this is the new Monza or new Suzuka. We should load up on drivers that are high on overtakes. But Rob, I think we need to dispel that when you look at the history from the previous years.
Exactly right. For those of you that watched the race, I'm sure you're well aware it was rain on and off throughout the duration. I actually rewatched the race yesterday just to get up to speed on exactly what happened on track. But it was exactly much like what we saw in Canada with the Haas drivers. They were just on the right tyres at the right times, and that was the case in Zandvoort last year. A lot of midfield drivers gambling on the intermediates when it was just about to come down, and then going back onto the softs at the right time. So capitalizing on those overtakes was why they were so high last year. But you pointed out, you've got to rewind all the way back to the years prior to that, under 25 overtakes in both of 2021 and 2022.
Those are Monaco-esque numbers. And to put it in perspective, last year, Esteban Ocon had almost as many overtakes as the entire grid did in 2022. So it's not a likelihood that we're going to see a lot of overtakes. Now, Rob, you developed a great method on how to respond to a circuit where you predict low overtakes and what that means for your lineup construction. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it is something that, I mean, I wouldn't take any credit for it. I think a lot of people have thought about this themselves too. But at these lower overtake tracks, at Budapest, at Monaco, for example, those are the tracks where there are fewer overtakes that are likely to work in favor of those midfield drivers that do rely on that so much for point scoring and price gain. K-Mag, Yuki Tsunoda, Esteban Ocon, for example, they're not going to have that luxury at Zandvoort, assuming it stays dry. And it's hard to look at the forecast, so far out from the race to confidently say what it will be on the race day. But I do think angling towards drivers that qualify quite well and have that upside to get as close to the points or in the points as possible is going to reward your team and have a bit more fantasy upside too. So that's kind of why I lined up my team in Spa to angle for a track like this in Zandvoort. Oscar Piastri, George Russell, and then very good qualifiers in Yuki Tsunoda and Nico Hulkenberg. So relying on a lineup like that or something like that, you could also go with Norris and Hamilton, as we've spoken about, could also set you up quite well for another good result at the Dutch Grand Prix. Is that kind of where your head's at as well, leaning into this weekend?
It is. I think I'm in a different situation only in that by the time I use my 2 free transfers, I'll take 1 -10 to get into a 2 tier B lineup. And then I'm in this weird spot where I have too many low end tier C drivers and a little bit extra budget. But do I want to take a -10 to go from a Zhou to a Hulkenberg? I might have to just let that slide one more week out and then potentially take a points delta this week for it. So I'm on the fence of how I want to handle that, but I really like that concept of investing in good qualifiers. Don't bank on a lot of overtakes and hope that someone qualifies a little out of their norm and then ends up in a top 10 finish.
And I think as well, we talked about Max before. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up winning or in the top 2 or 3 come the end of the Grand Prix. But his fantasy upside or ceiling of, let's call it 35 in Zandvoort, is going to be matched pretty closely by whoever finishes P2 and P3. And if you've got coverage of Mercedes and McLaren, that kind of production, when you're looking at a George Russell and an Oscar Piastri versus a Max Verstappen and let's call it a Daniel Ricciardo, for instance, is probably not going to marry up quite as nicely. So I think, as you say, Adam, it's probably worth a -10 for a double premium if you're not on that right now.
And also the other reason why it's so important to do it this way is if there are fewer overtakes, the average score is going to be a little bit lower, which means the bar for price gains is going to be a bit higher. So a double tier B lineup is going to do a lot more than a tier C heavy lineup. They're going to have to do a lot of work without overtakes to get enough points to warrant a price gain. So
100%.
very different math this week than we've had in previous weeks. Rob, let's move on now to some of the fantasy news that has broken over the last week and a half or so. First, as we broke on the Fantasy Formulas midseason review last week, the game just launched a mini league for the second half. So there's a great way to dive back into the game if the first half didn't work out for you, or if you want a second chance on the game and just get a fresh start with a whole new lineup. We've received a lot of questions on where to find it. It's bucketed under the mini league section, where the Zhou mini league for Shanghai was. So enter it today and you'll have a chance to win some great prizes, including 3-day passes to a race next season.
Yeah, excited for that. My team 2 has more or less been primed for the second half of the season league. Very few chips used, a bit of team value built. So really targeting those sprint races in the latter stages of the calendar to really make some headway into the top of the leaderboard there. So team 1 out of the equation, a few chips already used, but definitely got the 3X, Limitless, or whatever else there might be still to use on my team 2. So if you've got a second or a third team, think about using it on the second half league.
And then the other big news is that F1 Fantasy Tools is teasing a big update to their team calculator, which I imagine will be live in time for Zandvoort. So keep an eye out in this space or on Rob and I, our individual socials. We're going to give you as much information as we can get ahead of that launch, and maybe even on our live show coming up ahead of qualifying for the Dutch Grand Prix, a little bit of a walkthrough on how you can use it and get the most out of it.
Yeah, definitely excited to see what the F1 Fantasy Tools crew unveils for us. Lots of speculation, but nothing confirmed yet. So I'm looking forward to seeing this even more than who's announced for that second Sauber seat for 2025.
A lot of big news in store in the next few weeks. So ahead of seeing F1 Fantasy Tools' new team calculator, let's do our own predictions on some teams with 3 lineups for 3 budgets. Rob, let's start at that first lineup. Tell me what you've got.
I think we'll start with 115 million for some of the late joiners in F1 Fantasy or those that have just been on the wrong end of price gain so far this season. So I think if we're looking at a lower price team, I still think you can't look past McLaren and Mercedes as the two in-form constructors right now. I think Red Bull's probably a little pricey and Ferrari are probably a little out of sorts right now to go for anything other than these two guys.
And then even as low as 113.6 million, you can still structure a team around Piastri and Russell. You just have to take 3 of the bottom drivers in the grid in Bottas, Zhou, and Sargent. So this build that we've been talking about all show is accessible to pretty much everybody at this point.
I think so. The other thing I would say is maybe this lineup, we probably actually need to fill the slots before we can start rambling. But I think if you're trying to build budget at a track that isn't Zandvoort or at a higher overtake track, let's call it, I'd probably go for Norris and 4 C-tier drivers. So why don't we try that first? And the only reason I say this at higher overtake tracks is that the upside with price gain for the likes of Sonoda and Hulkenberg is probably much more than it would be for 3 crappy back markers. So throw in the overtakes. That leaves us with so with Bottas, that would come out just under 115 for this kind of lineup on screen.
I like that team. You've got 3 really strong assets at the top of your lineup, and like you mentioned earlier, some great qualifiers, potential overperformers in qualifying that could stick some great points for you in the Grand Prix too.
Definitely. I think for the second lineup, or for let's say a $120 million budget, we probably want to upgrade the back markers, as you talked about, from McLaren and Mercedes. I should have just left them in there. And then let's say we go for a lineup similar to what I had in Spa, so Oscar and George. And then we're probably looking at those better qualifiers, like you say, Adam. So give me some names that you think would work well for a lineup like this.
So fitting the bill on price, you could do Sonoda, Hulkenberg, Sargent. And at this point, like you had mentioned earlier, Sargent's basically the 2 Saubers in terms of risk and points upside. And then you get those 2 high qualifiers. And so even at this price point, you've got a very well-rounded team and something that could head into a higher overtake circuit and still be successful.
Agreed. I think you could also pivot into, as you talked about before, some of those more dreadful back markers like Bottas and Zhou, if it means upgrading someone like Russell to Lando Norris, if you think the McLarens are going to do quite well.
So if you did Bottas, Zhou, and Sargent, you could then do triple McLaren. So for those that are desperate to get into that top-heavy build, if you think McLaren's really going to muscle ahead of the rest of the pack in the second half, this is an entry way to do it. But be forewarned, eventually some of the reliability issues are going to catch up to those bottom 3 drivers, and you might be taking a few DNFs along the way.
I think as well, it just doesn't spell cost cap gain at all when you look at Lando Norris, who's an A-tier, McLaren, who's an A-tier, 2 Sauber drivers, and Logan Sargent that are almost a lock for going down in value week to week. So you're really only relying on Oscar Piastri and Mercedes to go up in value. 0.3 per week seems about average for both of those assets. And you've probably got about 0.6 loss for the other assets when you look at, or close to that, for Zhou, Bottas and Sargent, and Lando and McLaren are probably only going up 0.1, 0.2. So you're coming out about break even, not a lot of value. And if you haven't used that 3x chip and you're angling forward for that later in the season, this probably isn't the lineup I'd recommend if you're looking to build a bit more cost cap.
And I think that's why we've been harping on the Piastri Russell themed lineups. It enables so much more budget to upgrade the rest of your team. It gives you a little bit more completeness and also gives you a little less variability at the bottom of your team. Rob, let's move up to our last tier, the big money of 125 million. This is where you can do some really creative stuff.
So you'd probably go for, again, a team like this, right? And then just upgrade the fodder at the back to someone or some people that are better drivers and better qualifiers as well, I'd say, for a track like Zandvoort.
And so here it's our usual flavor of Sonoda, Hulkenberg, Sargent. And remember, wherever we say Sonoda here, for 0.4 million, you can do Daniel Ricciardo here too. And Rob
Hmm.
gave us a lot of great points as to why Danny Rick would be a good inclusion to your team. So Sonoda and Ricciardo are interchangeable here. But that's one flavor that you can do. Basically, a much better version of what we described as a risky lineup at 120. And and then the other way you could do this is Sonoda, Hulkenberg, Sargent or Zhou with Piastri and Hamilton. So then you get a piece of a McLaren with Lewis Hamilton winning 2 out of the last 3 races. He could be on a real roll here.
Definitely. I really like Lewis as well. He's come into his own recently, one of the highest rising drivers in the game in the last half dozen or so races. So I think, again, another driver like Oscar approaching 25 million, you're running out of time to squeeze out as much juice out of him as you can. So if it's not Zandvoort, you've probably only got one race more to get him in. And then by that point, I think his appeal drastically reduces.
And if you had Sargent as your last driver and Ricciardo instead of Sonoda in this build, you'd have the 1, 2, 3 top grossing drivers in terms of price gain over the last 5 races. So lots of good juju with this lineup.
Big fan of this. If you got enough budget to squeeze out 125 million, I am very jealous.
Me too. To the Fantasy Formula League leaderboard, our friend Leapsfrog is still in P1. He avoided all of the chaos at Spa, but he did use the final fix to go from Piastri to Verstappen. And so he's starting off with a Red Bull team as his constructor, with part of the lineup that you have, Rob, and one major chip off the board. So it'll be interesting to see if Andrew can hold on to his lead. He's also very high in the global league rankings, so fingers crossed that he keeps it up.
Yeah, it's getting really tight at the top of our leaderboard, isn't it? I feel like the delta of points between first, second, third has been quite spread out, but it looks like some of the guys further back have certainly moved up into the passenger seat, and Andrew's certainly trying to wrestle the steering wheel back to him heading into the second half.
You know, I was looking at a few of the top 10 teams, and there were a few really creative lineups. One of them that I saw multiple times was Max, Oscar, McLaren, and Ferrari. And somehow that team really cooked, and it's very unconventional. I definitely wouldn't have predicted it heading in back at our live show. So
Okay,
congratulations to those of you that were so bold and have reaped the benefits from it.
I don't know what people are cooking up if they've got Ferrari in their team, but that's something that's super spicy and definitely came through given how chaotic Mercedes were in Spa. So curious to see what Ferrari can do in the second half as well, given we haven't really talked about them much at all the last few weeks.
Oh, I hope they come back soon. I think that would make the top of the grid so interesting, and then give another layer of fantasy hopefuls that we can choose between week to week, especially as Russell and Piastri approach Tier A. If we could look back at Leclerc and Carlos Sainz as some high price gain candidates in the last third of the season, that would be really great. All right, we will be back this Saturday with our live show ahead of the Dutch Grand Prix. The action all starts at 8 a.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. BST. We'll have a lot of questions and a lot of lineups to review, so I hope you're there to see it. Be sure to answer our Fifth Gear Garms question of the week and submit your lineups through our fan app base for a chance to win some great prizes and be featured on the show too. Rob, any final thoughts before we break for this week?
Nope, can't wait to get back into the season. You're consuming content, producing content, just ingesting as much F1 fantasy as possible that it comes out of every single pore on my body. But it's going to be a big last 10 races on the calendar. A lot of ground I need to make up, and probably a lot of ground for us both to crack the top 5,000, the top 1,000. So looking forward to a challenging but hopefully very rewarding last 10 races of the year.
Thank you all so much for watching. I can't wait to have the second half of this season upon us. We will see you all this Saturday.